Well, then I think this will probably be it. I know Larry's under the weather, and Arthur is also out in Cole Camp, so
Oh, yep.
we will make do with our small but mighty crowd here. Anyway, let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious Lord, help us always to remember, particularly as the season of Christmas draws near, that we do not simply wait in the anticipation or in remembrance of what you have done once long ago, but most of all in anticipation of what you will accomplish through your Son when he returns. Lord, speed the day. Amen. All right, we are working through the end times. We talked, I think we just finished up last week talking about some stuff with the Antichrist. Were there any lingering things you wanted to talk about with that? He's a bad dude. He's going to cause trouble. And it's the office of the Pope. Anyway, so now today we're going to talk a little bit about specifically, probably the last topic we'll deal with in the end times thing here. Though again, if anybody wants to bring up some other stuff, by all means. We're probably going to talk a little bit about a hot topic in certain Christian circles, less so in ours, but millennialism. Now, I've mentioned the word already several times. We've talked briefly about the Left Behind series. They very, very famous book series for a while there. They even turned it into a movie, which I don't think I ever saw, but very big deal. Do you know why there's people who talk about the millennium? Where this whole idea of 1,000-year millennium comes from? Well, it does, in fact, come from the Bible. So let's turn to Revelation chapter 20. Everybody's favorite book of the Bible for clarity and simplicity. Now, if some brave soul wants to read verses 1 through 6 for us.
I'll give it a try. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent who is the devil and the Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until 1,000 years were ended. After that he must be released for a little while. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. Also I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life. And reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection.
All right. We'll just finish. Somebody want to read 6 through 10, just to get a nice, well-rounded version here of what Revelation is saying.
Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison, and he will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their numbers is like the sand of the sea, and they march up over the broad plain of the earth, and surround the camps of the saints and the beloved city. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them, and the devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophets were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever.
All right, and actually one more section we'll read. We'll just finish this whole chapter, 11 through 15. Somebody.
Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. The earth and the heavens fled from his presence, and there was no place for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Another book was opened, which is the book of life. The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books. The sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. And each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire, and the lake of fire is the second death. Anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire.
All right. Now, good, enjoyable nighttime reading just before bed. So, you'll notice, there's a lot of things that happen in that particular chapter. One of the big notable things that crops up several times is this time period of 1,000 years. There's, for instance, in 20 verse 2, there's the mention of 1,000 years that the dragon or the devil is bound and seized and basically imprisoned and limited in the pit for 1,000 years. And then, at the same time, relatively speaking, Jesus Christ returns, and people reign with him for 1,000 years. Or rather, I shouldn't say he returns. It doesn't actually talk about him returning. It says that he gets a vision of these souls who have been beheaded for Jesus, who didn't worship the beast. They come to life and they reign with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead don't come to life until the 1,000 years are ended. And then after that 1,000 years, verse 7, are ended, Satan is released from his prison and will deceive the nations again. Okay, so this is where we get this big phrase, millennialism. They're basically a bunch of different ideas that Christians have about what the heck is going on here in the book of Revelation with this 1,000 years. Now, one thing to say right off the bat, Revelation, despite my statement that this is a book of clarity, and it is not. If anybody comes to you and says, I know exactly what everything in the book of Revelation means, they're probably deluded, because this is a very, very hard book, by virtue of the fact that the type of book it is not meant to be straightforward prose like, say, one of the Gospels is, which is very straightforwardly just describing events as they happen. It's not even like many of the prophecies of the Old Testament, which once again are very straightforwardly describing things that will happen, or sometimes allegorically describing things that will happen, but in ways that are relatively straightforward to put together what they're talking about. This is a certain kind of literature. If you want the fancy word, it's called apocalyptic literature. Basically, these revelatory literature about what visions that people have, usually geared towards the end of the world, and it's highly, highly symbolic. I mean, from first to last, there is nothing but pictures of things meant to illustrate what will happen, and in ways that are not entirely clear what exactly is being symbolized. And maybe one time we'll do a Bible study on the book of Revelation. It's not my favorite book to do a Bible study on, because people have lots of questions, and I could read a whole lot of books on the book of Revelation and still only have sort of answers for anybody on a lot of these. But everybody agrees that a lot of what goes on here is picture language throughout the book of Revelation. For instance, most people probably don't believe that a literal beast is going to rise out of the sea and deceive the nations. Almost everybody believes that beast is representative of some particular figure, Antichrist, so on and so forth. Most people don't believe, for instance, that's for Revelation 7, one of those very famous books we like to have, where we even read some of it today at the funeral. You know that vision of those robed in white standing before the throne. Well, right before that, it goes about 144,000 people from Israel being sealed, more or less. Now, I promise you, there's only one group I've ever heard of that literally believes only 144,000 people are going to be saved. It's Jehovah's Witness, right? Yeah, similar. They're easy to get mixed up. The Jehovah's Witness are convinced only 144,000 people will be in the highest level of paradise with God based on this. Every other Christian group says 1,000 is a symbolic number of completion. 12 is a symbolic number of completion. When you times them together, it shows that it's just basically a way of saying the fullness of all who are saved. So it's not 144,000. It's just saying all of God's chosen people will be saved. Now I say this to say then yet somehow those same Christian groups will come to this and say, but this 1,000 years is literal. It means exactly the time period of 1,000 years. Even though throughout the book of Revelation, the number 1,000, we've already said, we're not translating literally, it's symbolic of something else. We'll stop all of that we've been doing here, and now that we've come to this set of verses, we're going to use it literally. Okay, obviously you can see where my sympathies lie. It's just to point out a fact about how most church bodies and theologians interpret Revelation. They take most numbers in the book of Revelation to be symbolic. That is, not literal numerical values, until they come to this point. Why? You'd have to ask them, I suppose. Maybe they have compelling arguments for that. It's just to point out the fact that a lot of numbers that they previously say are symbolic stop being symbolic when we get to these verses. Now, that being said, there are a lot of different views about what this all means. And we're not going to do a Bible study on what every element in this chapter means. Primarily, we're just going to use this as a jumping off point to talk about the three big ways that Christians have historically tried to make sense of these 1,000 years. And the reason we're doing this is this has a lot to do with what we expect will happen when we're talking about the actual return of Christ, which was kind of a big deal when we're talking about the end times. What are we looking forward to? The return of Christ. So how you look at these verses says a lot about what you expect when Christ comes, and also, kind of going back into that sign reading thing from last week, how you might know that he's on his way. But bigger thing is what you can expect. So there's three, well, I guess technically four big perspectives. You'll obviously find differences here and there, but you can usually lump Christians into one of four groups. And I'm going to write down these because they're kind of weird. We'll just start with post, well, I won't write the whole word, but post-millennialism, we'll call it classic, premillennialism, dispensational premillennialism, and down here at the bottom that doesn't need a lot of room, amillennialism. See that? All right, so these are the four basic types. So what is all that supposed to mean? Well, millennium, what does that word mean, millennium? Yeah, 1,000 years. So millennium is just the word for 1,000 years. If you know what your prefixes mean, you can probably guess that post-millennialism means after the millennium. So, and premillennialism means before the millennium. Do you remember what the prefix A means when it's on something? It basically means not. So, no millennium. All right. So let's just very quickly go through this. Postmillennialism is basically the idea that I'll just draw a nice little timeline to try to get you to the point here. Well, actually, since this is post, we'll put it way back here. So, after Christ is ascended into heaven, we have the church here moving along, and someday, what's going to happen is the church is going to become so influential in the world. It will so successfully preach the gospel to the bounds of the world, like Jesus talked about in Matthew about preaching the gospel to all nations. They take that kind of idea and say that the church will not only preach the gospel, but will be successfully preaching the gospel so much that for all intents and purposes, the entire world will become converted to Christ. And when that happens, on this great day, the 1,000-year reign of Christians begins. That is to say, the church will rule the world. Christians will be in charge of the world. There will be peace. There will be justice. Everyone will see the truth for a literal 1,000 years. After which there will be a brief period of tribulation and a falling away, and Christ will return. But key to the whole post-millennial idea is the church... Oh, somebody's coming, so I'll wait a minute, I think. Oh, it's your wife.
She made it.
Hey! You're a busy gal.
It has been a busy day.
It sounds like it.
We're glad you joined us.
Yes, thank you. I am too.
I'm making you suffer through one of our seminary courses on millennialism, just because we had to learn it, so I'm going to inflict it upon you. But no. No, we're talking about, bringing you up to speed quickly, the various views of what this 1,000-year is in the book of Revelation, and talking about how there's 4 basic views. We just started on one of the first ones, post-millennialism, which just was about to get to the big review, so that's great. The church will continue to see more and more success in converting the world until, for all intents and purposes, the world becomes Christian. And at that point, a literal 1,000-year political, and this is also important to say, it's a visible political empire where the Christians rule the world. And they rule with Christ, but Christ isn't actually on the world. He's kind of, well, in heaven, overseeing all of this, in just kind of the providential sense, and kind of the sense that we might say he's overseeing all things now, but in this sense he's still doing the same thing, but the church is firmly in control under his authority, moving to the 1,000 years, and then at the very end, there'll be a brief tribulation as Satan runs amok and people fall away, and then Christ returns and the resurrection happens. Okay? Now, just on the face of it, how likely do you think this scenario is that we are moving towards greater and greater influence with
That's
the
what I
church
was
in the world?
No.
Knowing our world now, that would be a huge miracle.
It'd be a miracle.
Yeah.
It is fair to say, and you could probably expect to see why this is the case, this was a much more popular view pre-World War I. There were quite a few Christian groups that held to this, and you could kind of see why. At 1900, people could without irony say, this is going to be the Christian century. We even have a famous Christian magazine, not we, the Lutherans, but Christians have a famous publication called The Christian Century. Have you ever heard of it? It's one of the more well-known magazines published by a Christian group, which was on the idea that this is the century that we're finally going to complete it, because we've got missionaries everywhere. The message seems to be going out and getting more reception, and it seemed for all the world like the church was growing and things were going possibly to end this way. Then, of course, World War I happened, and everything started to fall apart rather rapidly And very few people hold to this view anymore, just as a matter of clearly experience doesn't seem to be leading this way, and we don't have any reason to anticipate we're going to suddenly change course and grow in influence. So maybe we were misinterpreting Revelation here. Some still hold to it, but it's a pretty small group. I gotta use my handy chart here too. It's the premillennialisms that get very confusing. All right, so that's post, after. Premillennialism, I'll draw a nice little timeline here. This is just classic run-of-the-mill, the kind of premillennialism that usually is cropped up throughout church history, is the idea that first, Jesus returns, and again, key part, establishes a visible political kingdom over the world that lasts, can you guess how long?
1,000 years.
1,000 years. And there's some debate in this school about whether this tribulation we read about, the Great Tribulation, when Satan is released, comes before or after. But by and large, it's a pretty straightforward. As the end comes, most of them are pre-tribulationists, so they call it, or post-tribulationists, so that Christ comes after the tribulation and then comes, but not all of them. Anyway, 1,000 years. Then, at the end of the 1,000 years, comes the resurrection from the dead. Just put this, and I'll write the whole word. Straightforward stuff. Again, notice that the hope is what? Christ comes, and we're not going up to the new heavens and the new earth right away. We're going to live very happily, very successfully, 1,000 years here on earth.
Is that the people who are alive, or the people who are dead, or both?
Well, that depends on which group you're going to talk about. Some of them will say there's a first resurrection that we mentioned here that happens here. And so those martyrs that came before, and especially the people who believe in the tribulation prior, will color in this idea of the tribulation, where the beast, the Antichrist, and Satan gets loose before the coming. They'll say the martyrs and those who didn't bow to the beast, they'll all reign with Christ and live 1,000 years on earth. And the second death doesn't touch them, and so on and so forth. So they live for 1,000 years with Christ. But not all of them believe that. Some of them still believe that people will be being born and dying, and so on and so forth. But basic structure is Christ returns, then 1,000-year kingdom, and then the resurrection. Now, I'll complicate this one a little bit after we talk about the really weird one, but is there anything at this point you want to talk about? Because we are about to get into the weird stuff.
Mine sets a perfect earth for 1,000 years.
What's that?
Is that like a perfect earth for that 1,000 years?
Yeah,
and then
perfect
the
earth for 1,000 years. Christianity will be the only show in town during those 1,000 years.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be nice, but I don't know. I'd personally be okay with just going to heaven.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, if it's a perfect earth, you might as well just be in heaven.
Right.
Yeah, you would be heaven on earth, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting too about the idea of this being a very political kingdom, in the sense that it's an earthly kingdom, which probably helps you make sense too of why there are certain stripes of Christians who are very, very, very concerned with making Christian nations on earth. That is, they want to actually sort of inaugurate the kingdom, or the 1,000-year reign of Christ, by basically getting it kick-started here on earth, here and now, by passing Christian laws, compelling people to be Christian, driving out every other game in town. And if you can do that successfully, well, you're at the post-millennial hope. That is the post-millennial hope. We want to get the people elected who are going to make this a Christian nation, and not just this nation, but the Middle East, Russia. We want everyone to have a literal theocracy where they are ruled by the Bible, more or less.
How are they going to get rid of the people that don't believe in it?
Can't make an ant
Kill
without
them
breaking a
all?
few eggs, my friends.
I mean, are they going to kill them all, or
Well,
to achieve their goal?
how that happens is depends on the group, I suppose, you talk to. Classic postmillennialism isn't talking about let's get violent here. They're more, we're just going to persuade so many people and convert so many people, and then pass laws and have schools and everything that just keeps, passing this along. So this is all people will be. And like I said, it sounds on paper at a certain degree to be a good idea. On the one hand, here's a very big kicker. Are people sinless, therefore, in this? Now, you might say in the premillennial idea, they're saying some of them have come back from the dead. Some of them, not all of them. And therefore, they're probably sinless. But certainly not in that one. And probably in this one, there's a lot of people who haven't actually been risen from the dead and therefore received their bodies freed from sin. So are you going to have a perfect world? And what happens historically when you try to enforce, say, Christianity as the law of the land in a sinful world? Well, heresy becomes a crime punishable by death. Certain forms, you've read the Scarlet Letter, or at least know what it's about. Certain kinds of sin receive some pretty serious difficulty. Point being, it might not actually be as great in reality as it might sound on paper, unless you assume a whole lot of other things going on during this 1,000 years. Clearly on this one, Christ is physically present ruling, and this is another key one with premillennialism. Christ is actually the one at the head of all of this government. He is physically alive here running the show. And so, no doubt, if Christ is the one calling the shots, he's probably going to be a little more fair than a human government. But it's, well, on the one hand, you can foresee a lot of issues with it. One of the big ones we'll come to when we get down to amillennialism, about whether this is actually what the Bible teaches. But we'll get into some of these other sidebar questions here when we get to the very weird one. How many of you have heard of the Scofield Reference Bible, by the way? It is, I believe, one of the most widely sold versions of the Bible, put out by a guy named Scofield, which was very much selling dispensational premillennialism. Now, the reason we call it this is the idea. Basically, the Scofield guy, he read the Bible, and he's thought, well, God seems like he's not acting consistently throughout the Bible. He seems to be approaching people in fundamentally different ways at different stages of the Bible. I mean, we've probably all heard people say, well, the God of the Old Testament is very different than Jesus. This is a guy who took that basically to different levels. Boy, the God pre-flood seemed to be a lot different than the God post-flood. And the God post-flood seemed to be dealing with people a lot differently than post-Moses, and so on and so forth. And so the reason he said wasn't that these are different gods. He said it's because God had different dispensations, that is, different time periods that he was dealing with people by different arrangements. So he just had, to put it more terms we're probably familiar with, even though it technically wouldn't be called this, different covenants with people by which he would relate to them. So we'll just get through this. So there's the dispensation in Eden, which is the age of innocence. And of course you know how that one ends. So that didn't work, so God tried a different approach. He goes for the age of conscience, where people do not have an explicit law given by God, but they're supposed to, well, I guess, have Jiminy Cricket. Let their conscience be their guide. And this goes from Eden. This is basically, I should say this was the age of innocence. I got these swapped. This is the basically from after Eden to the flood. And obviously, if you know the story of the flood, you know how this dispensation turned out. People didn't really prove that they could be living up to the way of coming to life with God. And all of these dispensations have as their goal people coming to live in fellowship with God. Mankind couldn't keep in innocence. Conscience failed mankind. So then in the next one, we have the age of human government. This roughly from the flood to Abraham. I'm guessing because of the whole Tower of Babel thing is what they're going for, where it falls apart after humans try through their human government to ascend to the heights of God. Then, of course, you come to finally the, even though it's technically two, we'll just lump it to one, Israel, where you have the dispensation of intermediaries and laws. So you have priests, prophets, and the Mosaic law. Now, this is about where it's going to get a little confusing. Then you have the period of grace, which is current age, where you have Christ coming and starting a new covenant that goes beyond Israel to all the people and is based on simply the offer of grace justified for Christ's sake, so on and so forth. Until finally we come to the 1,000-year millennium. Now, one thing that's interesting is this period in their mind is actually still going. This one never got interrupted. This is kind of a tack on that God did not originally intend, but he decided out of his abundant grace to allow more people than just Israel through their intermediaries to come to him. So, if this is confusing to you and complicated, it's a very complicated system. One of the things that attracts people to it is it seems like it's a very complex, rational system for trying to make sense of the various epochs in the Bible. But one of the things to know is, like premillennial, once you get to the millennium, you kind of get to something like this, with one very big kicker. They're almost always pre-tribulation, or post. They're almost always, there's a brief tribulation here, and the big tribulation is here after the fact when Christ returns. So they're kind of like this. There's a little period here after, which point Christ will return. He'll establish his 1,000-year reign here on heaven, on earth, and so forth. And then at the end there'll be the great tribulation, a 7-year period where the devil will be released. He'll be making life miserable, and then Christ will ultimately return again, I guess. I don't know what happens to him there, but he'll come again and destroy the devil once and for all, cast them down to hell, and bring up the people to heaven. Now, one big thing to this is there's a very strong idea that there is a process that brings us finally to the millennium. One of those big things is Israel's dispensation has to be fulfilled. God hasn't given up on Israel, as Paul says in Romans. Has God rejected his people? By no means. And so they take that to mean that covenant is still in place and in force. And in fact, as a precursor to bringing the millennium, and if you want to bring the millennium, what has to happen first, it's not to say we can bring it, but something that has to happen prior to the possibility of Christ returning, is Israel must return to its temple and have their priests and all of the Levitical codes practiced once again, because that is still in force. And so if that's going to happen, what do you have to make sure has a country?
Israel.
The Jews. And what do you have to... we're not there yet, by the way, in this thing. Because what does not yet exist in the nation of Israel? The temple is still just a wall. Until that sucker gets rebuilt, and until we get a priesthood descended from Aaron back on the roster doing the daily sacrifices, and yes, all of the sacrifices must still be made, the second coming ain't happening. So it's politically wise, if you take this view, to be a strong supporter of the nation state of Israel, and a strong supporter of making sure that Israel retakes the Temple Mount and builds the temple. You might remember a couple of times ago I said this does actually have a huge amount to do with our foreign policy toward Israel, because historically we have had a lot of Christians in positions of power, evangelical Christians, who do subscribe either to, and a lot of them do, have in the past I should say, subscribed to this or this. And this one does not preclude this one. This idea that Israel needs to be restored as God's people, or at least has a favored status that we should therefore favor. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, do not take this to mean that this implies any proper political orientation that I am implying for us toward or against Israel. I am not saying that this has anything to do with how you should feel about Israel, particularly in its current conflicts with Hamas. This is completely irrelevant to that. This is simply to highlight a fact that because people in office have held these religious views, they have tended to support a certain diplomatic policy toward Israel. For obvious reasons. If you believe this, you'd be crazy not to. Makes sense. Any questions about that? Now, one little thing. A lot of these also believe in one little hitch here, particularly called the rapture. We talked briefly about this before. Not every premillennialist believes in the rapture, but a lot of them do. The idea being that prior to this horrible outbreak of violence and evil and iniquity that comes before Christ's return, Christ is going to spare his most faithful, devoted Christians that difficulty. They will be raptured out of this world, and then returned when Christ returns to rule with him for 1,000 years. Sometimes you might have seen images or people talking about how they'll be, your friend will suddenly disappear. They'll just be neatly folded piles of clothes and so forth. One of the places they like to go in is Jesus in the Gospels talking about his second coming, where he talks about how one will be left in the field and one will be taken, so on and so forth. I guess we could dive into that, but let's just say it isn't clear that this is what it means. For the simple, and I think it's a good way to demonstrate that, for the simple fact that almost no church theologian throughout the past 2,000 years has taken it to mean anything like that. It's only fairly recently in history, 1850s again, in America and Britain especially, where this idea suddenly started to catch on that what Christ meant there is that those people would literally be taken up and raptured prior to the second coming of Christ to avoid the tribulation and then returned down to earth to reign with him for 1,000 years.
So where do they go?
They just go up to heaven, basically, to be with him in paradise.
Gotcha.
Until things have settled down, time is right. And I suppose it's kind of like saying, a parent saying to the kid, you've been really, really good, so you can stay home from this horrible test that's coming up, and we'll put you back in school after the exams.
Yeah, and then she will say, you got to take it today.
And Mama's on the school board, so you don't have to worry about it.
So with that thing with Israel, though, and the temple and everything, does that mean that all the Jews would have to become practicing Jews and keep them kosher and all that other stuff again before?
I mean, the specific number, I don't know. Obviously, they mean the vast majority. There's probably, like with the Jews, as with the Christians, there's always going to be some who are unbelievers and not serious Jews. And I imagine that they will be. I haven't actually read up on that, so I'm speculating what I think the answer would be. So take this disclaimer. This is my own personal speculation about what they might be asserting. They probably do assert something. It'd be good to look it up. They probably are asserting that those who are not the elect Jews, that is, the ones who are fallen away and are not the righteous remnant of the Jews, will, like Jews of previous eras, be swept away in the wrath of God, is my guess. But that's a guess.
Because if the temple has to be in place, then they would have to be following all of the Jewish laws, including dietary.
Right, they would have to be doing that, yes. All of those laws
And
will
the
have to
majority
place,
of the
and there
people-
will have to be
the
Jews.
majority of the Jews are no longer
Right.
practicing all of those laws.
Some of the Jews are, but not a
There's
lot
a
of,
few,
yeah,
but
there are.
the majority
I mean,
are.
obviously not the sacrifices because they have no temple, so they can't.
Right.
But yes, and it's worth saying in these dispensations, there's always been the some who make it and the some who don't. I mean, except for Eden, I should say. That's a wrong place to put that. For instance, Noah comes through the flood, even if nobody else does. A couple people pass through that one, even if somebody else does. And all throughout the history of Israel, there's always the talk of the righteous remnant, the people who are faithful and remain, and there's a whole lot who don't, and they get swept away in the wrath of God. Interestingly, while this is enforced, this is very much to say this is a tack-on. They are under a completely separate dispensation. The people who are under the covenant of grace have no obligation to keep any of those temple restrictions. But we, because we value what God wants to do with the Jews, will support Israel in their following the Levitical laws, understanding that that is their means that God has given them to relate to him. So at the same time, there will be two different classes of people, Jews and Gentiles, who are under two different covenants, who relate to God and come to God in two different ways. In a certain sense, one could probably even go so far as to say those Jews who try to get into this covenant are going at it the wrong way, because they are in this covenant, not under this one. So Jews for Jesus ought to knock it right the heck off. Makes sense? At least once the temple is back in place, I should say. Up until then, maybe. But it's interesting. And again, it does affect the way you actually do things down on the ground when you think this is how the world goes. For one thing, we talked about the practical political consequences for some of our political views if you hold to some of these things. We've talked a little bit about, for instance, especially with the post-millennials, but it also comes in the premillennialist type, of wanting to inaugurate the kingdom of God here on earth by passing more Christian laws and trying to persuade and regulate even people into the Christian religion. And again, just the very way that you hope for what will happen in the future. You have a much more, I suppose you have a big stake on the one hand in keeping this world going in a certain way if you think that a big part of your hope is 1,000 years still on this world before the new heavens and the new earth are created. By the same token, if you're thinking of a rapture happening, if you're really faithful, I got to think you have a very big stake in trying to make sure you are part of that rapture. And interestingly, notice how one of these problems with this sets up a two-tiered Christianity. You have the people who are good enough to get there. So why are they good enough and everybody else is not? Because it's clearly in this way of doing it a certain class of people who were better than the rest by some particular metric. So what's the metric?
Works righteousness.
Well, in some, it will almost always boil down to that. Even if you say they have a uniquely strong faith, well, then there's faith as strong as a mustard seed, and then there's the darn tree, baby.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good for the trees. Sorry, you guys. The people who have the weak faith have to have it tested in the tribulation.
But then there's those that believe in the rapture before, and the ones that believe in it after.
Right, yeah, and then this gets into whether we're talking, more big terms, pre-tribulational premillennialism or post-tribulational premillennialism as to when the rapture happens. Some of them will say, well, no, there is no big tribulation here. The rapture happens here just before Satan is unleashed. And then, everybody gets together again at the end. So, thoughts about this before we go into the last. That will take very little time to explain.
Seems like a lot to keep straight.
Oh.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is a reason that there are lots and lots of manuals about this one, because I mean, these two, okay, they've got some steps to it, but you could probably without too much work, understand the basic gist of how these things are supposed to work. This one is a very complex thing that gets into all kinds of intense Bible study, usually again using the Scofield Reference Bible as your primary source, because it has all these helpful commentaries in the side and marginal notes telling you what this dispensation is about, what's going on here, how this prefigures something else here. Gets heavily into things like Daniel, where it uses all the numbers in Daniel to try to count. It gets very heavily involved in numbering dates and things like that. But this is a, whatever else you want to say about it, it is a rigorous thought stream. That's not to say that it's always logically consistent or biblically consistent. It is to say you can dive very deep into this to learn a lot about the view.
Yeah, we could see you could easily make sense of all of those up until the last couple, I guess. Those first few was Eden and the flood. I mean, you could easily see that God had a different mindset through there.
Yeah, and there, again, it just kind of falls out of the basic thing of, boy, it seems like God is dealing with people a little differently here.
Yeah.
And a lot of this comes out of a lot of things that Paul says regarding the relationship of the new Christian religion to the old Jewish religion. It does kind of have to ignore a lot of what Paul says about, the old law being put away.
Yeah.
Well,
There
man
are no
sinned,
new
he
moons and
screwed up.
Sabbaths and all of this and so on and so forth.
When man sinned, he screwed up the whole timeline.
Why that? What'd you do?
When man sinned
Oh,
in the Garden of Eden, he screwed up the whole timeline
yes, he did.
because
There could have just been one dispensation.
Exactly.
We
None
could have
of
all
this
been
would have
innocent.
mattered if,
Yeah.
if they hadn't sinned.
Which, to be fair, one could say that about any particular way, is if only Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, none of this would have happened. Which, I suppose, is true. But it's one of those important things to know. God created with the fall in mind as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
This wasn't plan A failed. Let's go to plan. This is one of the
Right.
other things about this. This
Right.
is very much a plan A didn't work. Plan B didn't work. Plan C didn't work. Plan D. That one's still coming. We'll also shoehorn plan E.
God didn't have it figured out. He's shooting from the hip as he goes through.
Wow.
Or if he did, he already planned
He's
for
already
phases
screwed up
of
sometimes.
failure.
Yeah.
Anyway, all right, so that's millennialism.
So can you, for lack of a better way to put it, could you call that a sect?
Well, here's one of the other things too that's worth saying about millennialism. It is not a teaching that fits into a denomination. You will be hard pressed to find too many church bodies that overtly subscribe to any one of these. These are things that grip the imaginations usually of particular members of any given denomination. For instance, there are a lot of Baptists who hold to either this one or this one, and some that hold to this one, and some that hold to this one. There are, same could be said about Presbyterians, same could be said about Methodists, same could be said, not probably so much about Lutherans and Catholics, but you probably would find some members in those church bodies who do that. These are not, in other words, generally speaking, official church positions. However, I will give a caveat. They are the official positions of certain groups, specifically Pentecostals don't necessarily say dispensational premillennialist, but they tend to say premillennialist. Similarly, a lot of non-denominational churches tend very strongly to, on their websites, and you have to check the individual church. That's the thing about a non-denominational church, is you just have to look at what that church says. But a lot of them are very explicitly premillennial of some form. But by and large, the main line and traditional and all these other long-standing church traditions don't officially take one of these stands. There are some that do take one official stance, which is to say amillennialism. Now, what is amillennialism? Well, quite simply, what it says is 1,000 years does not equal 1,000 years. It is symbolic. It is a number like 1,000 throughout the rest of the book of Revelation, which is frequently used in the book of Revelation, and everybody, like I said, agrees in other places. It's a symbolic number meaning completeness, fullness. That's what it means here too. So what these groups tend to mean is the 1,000 years began the day that Christ ascended into heaven. So that we are in the 1,000 years. Satan is currently bound. He's not powerless, but he's limited in what God allows him to do. And we are relatively free to hear the gospel, to proclaim the gospel, to teach the gospel, to come to faith, and to exist under Christ's reign through his word in the kingdom, which is now. So Christ is reigning for 1,000 years right now. Christ is reigning from his throne in heaven over us right now for this 1,000-year period, which may last, it's already gone 2,000 years. It may last longer. But point being, until the fullness of his reign is completed, this is the period we are in, is what this says. And then at the end of time, Christ returns, resurrection. We skip over everything about the rapture, all this stuff with Israel, so on and so forth. Just Christ ascended, he's ruling over all things, Satan is relatively bound, and that's it. We are in the age of the church. We are under the reign of the kingdom of Christ through his word and through faith. And yes, sometimes we'll say there probably will be a period right before the end where there will be a great tribulation, where there will be Satan will be unleashed, things will get really, really bad, but Christ will return, new heavens, new earth, resurrection. Now, this is the official position of the Roman Catholic Church, of the Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, and I'm pretty sure every Lutheran church body ever. This is just what we believe. It makes the most sense of the book of Revelation and makes most sense of all of the New Testament. You'll notice it avoids problems of two-tiered Christianity, on the one hand. It certainly avoids trouble with the idea that we need to establish a political kingdom at all. We're complete. Amillennial church bodies tend to be utterly, if you get a relatively Christian government, great. Doesn't mean anything for the terms of how history is going and where it's going to turn out. And if you don't, too bad, so sad. Christ is still in control. He's still ruling from his throne. We are still under his grace. Now we're just waiting for the end, whenever that'll come.
That's a lot less complicated.
It does have the virtue of simplicity. Doesn't make it right by being simple, but
Makes a lot more sense.
I agree. I kept thinking, well, this just doesn't coincide with what I've learned all these years. And finally we get to
Sure.
something. Yeah.
and of course, being Lutherans, we're all probably biased that way. Fair enough. If I'm not going to try to do this, but it wouldn't be unreasonable to say, well, maybe our position is worth examining. Let's measure it up about why we believe this specifically versus why these other groups believe those specifically. I think it's always a good idea to let your assumptions about what the Bible teaches be challenged, because people have been wrong since the beginning of time. That's not because the Bible isn't clear, but because we don't know it as well as we think we do sometimes. And it's good to be challenged. But yeah, this isn't what you learned. And this is, and I obviously being a Lutheran, am very much 100% on the page with you that this not only is simpler, but it just more simply reflects what the Bible teaches.
Mm-hmm. I think the Seventh-day Adventists are somewhere in the top.
Yeah, they're their own beast in a certain sense. But yeah, they definitely are more of a millennial kind of view.
Yeah.
But they're complicated by the idea that because one of their founding prophets had a vision that Christ returned on a certain date, and they believe her to be a prophet, and Christ obviously didn't return, they had to reinterpret that to mean it was a spiritual return. And so now I'd have to do more reading to
Was
say
that a
where they
Seventh-day
fall in
Adventist
the whole
thing, or was
millennium
that
idea.
Someone else. I didn't think that was Seventh-day Adventists that said that they. I thought it was some off-the-wall group.
Well, there's probably a couple that have done that too.
But yeah, that was quite a while ago.
Seventh-day Adventists, by the way, if you're ever needing to rent a church for Sunday worship, they are a good place to go.
Yeah, because they worship on
Exactly.
Saturday.
They're never
Yeah.
using the church on Sunday.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, they worship on Saturday.
The
so.
world was supposed to end in like 1981 or something. 1981.
Yeah,
or
I'd never.
something
Yeah,
like that.
I'd heard the other, the 1,000 years reigns, the rapture, and all that. I guess I've never heard the idea that Israel was supposed to become back to its full original
Sure.
covenant. That's interesting.
See, I had, but I'm not sure what the context was. Like, that was ringing a bell to me, but I'm not really sure why. Because I've never thought of it in that context, but I definitely have heard about the
I
restoring
could
of
see
the
of
temple,
Israel-
and then
Yeah,
coming to full
before the
completion.
second coming,
Yeah.
or before something, but I never
Yeah.
heard it tied into the premillennialism.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, of course, just trying to be fair to all the other views here, when you're taking those views, you're also convinced you are not, in fact, living in the end times right now. Because you're not living in the end times until either the 1,000 years begins or until, if you happen to be a post-tribulationist, till the tribulation comes. And so there's a certain sense of not expecting the end in any immediate sense because, well, you're not at the end. You might personally die, but the end of the world is not yet. And we know it won't be until certain signs still yet to take place. Whereas amillennialists will say, we're in the end times. Christ could return literally any minute. All the signs are fulfilled and have been fulfilled ever since his ascension. And so, get ready. All right. Anything else you guys want to chat about? That timing worked out just about perfectly. And now you can pass the seminary quiz. Define the 4 types of millennialism.
I'm glad we ended on a good note there, because boy,
You would have a little trouble if I said, and this is what we believe.
yeah.
No,
I was like, man, I don't know where this come from, but
And this is when it's time to start church shopping.
Yep,
Oh.
that was what you said. But, nope, I don't think so.
No, your pastor is many things, but he is not a millennialist. So.
Good.
Well, that brings us to the end of the end.
It's interesting.
We will have to figure out what to study next time. Any ideas really quickly? We're going to get into 2 Bible study mode here in a couple of weeks. One between services and one at night.
Yep.
Well, shoot me a thought if you ever have one. But let's close with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. I will close with just one reiteration. We did not do a deep dive into why any of these positions is true or not true. We were just overviewing the positions out there. So
That was enough.
we would have to go into a lot more detail about why if we were interested in actually defending a position to anybody.
Well, how confused do we want to be?